The series, The Fugitive, kept all of America on the edge of its seat for 4 seasons. An innocent doctor flees the death penalty and, completely alone, chases the real killer across the country. But what happened to the actors once the cameras stopped rolling was sometimes more dramatic than any episode. Let's see where they are in 2026. Did you know that one of the actors on this show looks so much like a criminal that the police once stopped him right on the street, mistaking him for a wanted man? Did you know that the man whose deep velvety voice narrated every episode racked up, by his own count, more than 7,000 roles on radio? And did you know that a little boy who appeared in one episode of this show would go on to become one of the biggest stars in Hollywood? Someone whose name Walt Disney wrote down on a slip of paper as one of his final words before he died. On top of that, future legends passed behind the cameras of this story, from Oscar winners to genre film icons. And a lot of them were dirt young beginners at the time. These people's stories are full of rises, losses, and unexpected twists. Let's get started. At number 1, we have David Janssen as Dr. Richard Kimble, the man on the run, whom we watched from 1963 to 1967. David was 32 when he became the most famous fugitive on television, and he appeared in all 120 episodes of the series. Sadly, David died tragically in February 1980 at just 48 years old, and his death shook the entire industry. His real name was David Harold Meyer, and he took his stepfather's last name. Few people knew that early in his career, 20th Century Fox dropped his contract, deciding that his unusual hairline and big ears weren't right for the big screen. It was a hard blow, but he didn't give up and kept working. Real fame came to him precisely through the role of the hounded, tormented Dr. Kimble, and audiences loved him so much that every week some stranger would call his house wanting to help the fugitive. After the show ended, David threw himself into a punishing work pace, shooting dozens of TV movies and new series like O'Hara, U.S. Treasury, and the cult favorite Harry O, where he played a private detective. He was married twice and led an intense, exhausting life. He drank heavily and, by some accounts, smoked several packs a day. When he died, producer Quinn Martin eulogized him as a true professional and a superstar. Some believe this devoted, stubborn actor simply worked himself to death. Curiously, as actress Debbie Reynolds recounted, Janssen himself believed, half joking, half serious, that he was the illegitimate son of the legendary Clark Gable. Dr. Kimble always put others' needs ahead of his own, and David Janssen gave him a sad, deeply human soul that's impossible to forget. At number 2, we have Barry Morse as the relentless Lieutenant Philip Gerard, the man who pursued Kimble across all 4 seasons. Barry was 45 when he became the embodiment of the fate hanging over the fugitive. Surprisingly, he appeared in fewer than a third of the 120 episodes, and yet was one of the show's most recognizable and unsettling faces. Barry died in February 2008 in London at the age of 89 after a brief illness. He was born in a poor part of London, left school as a teenager, and won a scholarship to the prestigious Royal Academy of Dramatic Art. It's estimated that over his 70-year career, he played more than 3,000 roles across radio, television, theater, and film. Few people knew that the role of the cold, hard-headed Gerard was a complete break from his usual register. Before, he tended to play warm, colorful characters, and American television initially didn't quite know what to do with him. After The Fugitive, Barry enjoyed a second wave of fame among science fiction fans, playing Professor Victor Bergman in the British series Space, 1999. He moved to Canada in the early 1950s and worked so much in local television that he was jokingly nicknamed the test pattern of Canadian TV. Barry was married to actress Sydney Sturgis for nearly 60 years until her death, and left behind 2 sons who also went into the theater. He even wrote a memoir about his work on The Fugitive in Space, 1999, a series that, at its peak, drew some 28 million viewers. Gerard looked like a ruthless hunter without an ounce of compassion, but Barry Morse was a gentleman of the theater, refined and kind, who lived a long and full life. At number 3, we have Bill Raisch as Fred Johnson, the famous one-armed man, the real killer, whom we saw throughout the entire series from 1963 to 1967. Bill was 58 when he became perhaps the most famous villain on television, appearing in about 10 episodes. Bill died in July 1984 in Santa Monica at the age of 79 of lung cancer. His real name was Carl William Raisch, and his life before the show was as interesting as the role itself. He'd been a dancer in the famous Ziegfeld troupe and performed on New York stages, and he lost his right arm during World War II after suffering terrible burns in a shipboard fire. Few people knew that it was precisely his disability that got him cast again and again as a villain, and that his most memorable role before The Fugitive was a fight with Kirk Douglas in the film Lonely Are the Brave. After playing the one-armed man, Bill became so recognizable that he couldn't find any other work, and producer Quinn Martin had to keep him on a steady salary just to give him some stability. There was even a nearly comic incident. Some Los Angeles cops stopped him on the street thinking he was a wanted fugitive, and he had to convince them he was just the actor from the show. After The Fugitive ended, Bill, fed up with the eternal villain stigma, almost completely gave up acting and became an acting teacher on the west side of Los Angeles, working with young talent until his death. For that dark role, he later landed at number 5 on TV Guide's list of the scariest villains on television. The one-armed man was Kimble's nightmare, but Bill Raisch in real life was an affable teacher who had nothing in common with his sinister on-screen character. At number 4, we have William Conrad, the voiceover, the narrator who guided viewers through every episode from 1963 to 1967. William was about 43 when his unmistakable velvety baritone became an essential part of the show's atmosphere and of every chase. William died in February 1994 in Los Angeles at 73 of a heart attack. His real name was John William Cann Jr., and over 5 decades he built one of the most versatile careers in show business history. Few people knew that, by his own count, he played more than 7,000 roles on radio and originated Marshal Matt Dillon in the radio version of Gunsmoke, before the on-screen role went to another actor because of William's heavy build. His voice narrated the Rocky and Bullwinkle cartoons, and during the war, he served as a pilot and as a producer for the Armed Forces radio service. After The Fugitive, William, known for his imposing girth, found real fame as an actor in front of the camera, playing a detective in the hugely popular series Cannon, then the investigator Nero Wolfe, and later a prosecutor nicknamed the Fat Man in the series Jake and the Fat Man. He even joked that a weight control organization had supposedly forbidden its members from watching Cannon, though that turned out to be a gag. His career spanned 5 decades and 3 eras: radio, film, and television. And he was not only an actor, but also a director and producer. For his work, he received an Emmy. In 1997, he was inducted posthumously into the Radio Hall of Fame, recognized as one of the great voices of his time. Viewers never saw his face on The Fugitive, but it was William Conrad's voice that set the tone for every one of Kimble's desperate escapes and every one of his moral choices. At number 5, we have Jacqueline Scott as Donna Kimble Taft, Dr. Kimble's loyal sister, whom we watched from 1964 to 1967. Jacqueline was 32 when she first appeared, as the one person in her family who never doubted her brother's innocence. She took part in 5 episodes, including the legendary 2-part finale. Jacqueline died in July 2020 in Los Angeles at 89, after battling lung cancer. She was born in Missouri and started competing in dance contests at age 3. After moving to New York, she performed on Broadway, including in the original staging of the famous play Inherit the Wind. Few people knew that the final episode of The Fugitive, which featured her character, drew some 78 million viewers to their screens and was for many years the most watched episode in the history of American television. Jacqueline was one of the most in-demand supporting actresses of her era. 8 episodes of Gunsmoke, 5 of Wagon Train, roles on Perry Mason, in Steven Spielberg's feature debut Duel, where she played the wife of Dennis Weaver's character, and a memorable role as a bank robber's wife in the film The Laughing Policeman, alongside Walter Matthau. She used to say that what she valued most was getting to play very different characters, sometimes the good girl, sometimes the bad one. Her husband, screenwriter and press agent Gene Lesser, to whom she was married for 6 decades, died just weeks before she did. Donna was Kimble's quiet support in his darkest moments, and Jacqueline Scott was a model of reliable, hard-working talent across 5 decades. At number 6, we have Diane Brewster as Helen Kimble, the doctor's murdered wife, whose death set the entire story of the series in motion. Diane was 32 when she appeared as the woman we see only in flashbacks, but whose shadow hangs over every episode. Diane died in November 1991 in California at 60 of heart failure. She was born in Kansas City and studied liberal arts in college before turning to acting. Few people knew that she was a direct descendant of one of the pilgrims who came to America on the Mayflower. Remarkably, Diane stuck in audiences' memory through 3 completely different characters in classic series. The cunning con artist Samantha Crawford in The Western Maverick, the sweet pretty teacher Miss Canfield in the sitcom Leave It to Beaver, and the ill-fated Helen Kimble in The Fugitive. She turned her brief appearances into genuine acting triumphs. Even with just a few episodes of Maverick, her character was such a hit with audiences, thanks to her chemistry with James Garner, that they kept bringing her back. It's said that on The Fugitive, she shot the flashbacks essentially as a personal favor to the show's creator, Roy Huggins. In the 1980s, she briefly returned to the role of her beloved teacher in the Leave It to Beaver sequel, after which she retired from the profession for good and led a quiet life away from the cameras. Helen Kimble spoke only a handful of lines on screen, but it was for her that Richard Kimble went through 4 years of hell, and Diane Brewster proved that you don't need much screen time to leave a brilliant mark on television history. At number 7, we have Andrew Prine as Ray Kimble, the Doctor's resentful younger brother, whom we saw in an important first season episode in 1964. Andrew was 28 when he played a man whose life had been wrecked by his brother's notoriety. Ray lost his job and his fiancée and started recklessly racing cars, as if it didn't matter to him whether he lived or died. Andrew died in October 2022 while on vacation in Paris at 86 of natural causes. He was born in Florida and made his debut on Broadway. Later played Helen Keller's brother in The Miracle Worker, an Oscar-nominated film. Few people knew that over his extensive career, he racked up more than 180 roles in film and television, and that he was a genuine king of the Western. He made 3 films with director Andrew McLaglen, The Devil's Brigade, Bandolero, and Chisholm, the last of those with John Wayne himself. And, in his own words, the only person who could rein him in was Wayne. Andrew usually did his own stunts and injured his knees and shoulders more than once. And he said he'd never come across a role he didn't like, and that in the 1970s he was willing to take literally any job. Besides westerns, he also made horror films that later became cult classics, like The Town That Dreaded Sundown. And on television he's remembered for his role in the science fiction miniseries Phi. His personal life was turbulent. He married several times, including 3 times to the same actress, Brenda Scott, and spent his final decades happily with his wife, Heather Lowe. For his contribution to the Western genre, he received the prestigious Golden Boot Award. Ray was a complicated character, sore at the whole world, but Andrew Prine remained a favorite of his colleagues and one of the hardest working character actors in Hollywood to the end of his days. At number 8, we have James Sikking as Leonard Taft, Donna's husband and Kimble's brother-in-law, whom he played for the first time in the first season, in 1964. James was about 30 when he appeared as the upstanding family man who supported his wife in her loyalty to her fugitive brother. James died in July 2024 in Los Angeles at 90 from complications of dementia, surrounded by his family. He was born in Los Angeles and was the youngest of 5 children. Few people knew that he was named James Barrie after the author of Peter Pan, and that his mother, after a nearly fatal car accident, founded her own church. Although he had only a small part in The Fugitive, and later appeared on the show as other characters, enormous fame lay ahead of him. He became one of producer Stephen Bachko's favorites and rose to fame as the unflappable SWAT Lieutenant Howard Hunter, always with his pipe, in the legendary cop series Hill Street Blues, a role for which he was nominated for an Emmy. For a whole generation of the 1990s, he's the kindly Dr. David Hauser, the father of the boy genius played by Neil Patrick Harris in the popular comedy Doogie Howser. MD science fiction fans also remember him as Captain Styles in the film Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, as well as for his roles in Ordinary People, Capricorn 1, and The Pelican Brief. He began his long career back in the mid-1950s with a small film role, with more than 6 decades of work ahead of him. Off-screen, James spent 19 years reading books to elementary school students through a volunteer program and raised money for medical research. Leonard Taft was the quiet support of the Kimble family, and James Sikking, built a 6-decade career that became a model of steadiness, dignity, and integrity. At number 9, we have Richard Anderson, who played Leonard Taft in the famous 2-part series finale in 1967, and who had earlier played several different episodic roles on The Fugitive. Richard was about 40 when he became Kimble's brother-in-law in that finale of sky-high ratings that literally the whole country watched. Richard died in August 2017 in Beverly Hills at 91 of natural causes. He was born in New Jersey, and after 2 years in the Army, he studied at an actor's workshop and gradually became one of the most dependable faces on American television. Few people knew that he reached the height of his fame back in the 1970s, playing Oscar Goldman, the boss of the bionic superheroes, on 2 hugely popular series at once, The $6 Million Man and The Bionic Woman, which aired in tandem. It was his voice that delivered the famous opening line about having the technology to rebuild the hero. Richard also appeared on Perry Mason and in films like Stanley Kubrick's Paths of Glory and 7 Days in May. His personal life was part of Hollywood history. His first wife was actor Alan Ladd's daughter, and his second was the daughter of the legendary actress Norma Shearer and film producer Irving Thalberg. His colleague Lee Majors fondly called him the money in the bank for his unchanging style, his calm, and his elegance, and insisted he'd never met anyone else like him. The finale of The Fugitive was one of the most talked about events in television history, and Richard Anderson proved to be a fitting capstone to that great saga before becoming an icon himself for a whole generation of young viewers. At number 10, we have Clint Howard as Little Billy Taft, Dr. Kimble's nephew, whom we saw in the first season episode Home is the Hunted in 1964. Clint was only about 4 when he played one of Donna's children for a reunion with whom Kimble risked his freedom and his life. In 2026, Clint turns 67 and is still working actively, which is astonishing in itself. Few people knew that Clint is the younger brother of the famous Oscar-winning director Ron Howard, and that both started out as child actors around the same time. Clint landed his first notable role on the series Gentle Ben and lent his voice to Disney cartoons like The Jungle Book. As an adult, he became a beloved character actor, appearing in 17 of his brother's films, including Apollo 13 and Cocoon, and also became known for his roles in comedies and horror films. He's worked across practically every generation of the Star Trek universe and appeared in Solo, A Star Wars Story, and the recent horror film Terrifier 3. In 2024, he also showed his dramatic side, playing an eccentric homeless musician on daytime soap The Bold and the Beautiful, a role for which he received a Daytime Emmy nomination in 2025. His older brother Ron is sincerely proud of him and says Clint is a unique, inventive talent with a rhythm all his own. As of 2026, Clint still has several new projects in the works. Little Billy grew up to become one of the most recognizable and beloved character actors in Hollywood, one who isn't slowing down 6 decades after his appearance on The Fugitive. At number 11, we have Bill Mumy as David Taft, Dr. Kimble's second nephew, whom we also saw in the episode Home is the Hunted in 1964. Bill was about 10 when he played the older of the Taft family's 2 boys. In 2026, Bill turns 72, with an astonishing career of more than half a century behind him. Few people knew that, barely a year after The Fugitive, he became truly famous playing Will Robinson in the cult science fiction series Lost in Space. Even earlier, as a very small boy, he had already appeared in one of the most famous episodes of The Twilight Zone, It's a Good Life, where he played a creepy child with a terrifying power, able to punish adults with his mind. A fun fact: they originally wanted to give Bill the role of Eddie Munster on The Munsters, but his parents turned it down because of how heavy the makeup was. As an adult, Bill not only kept acting, but also became a successful musician, voice actor, and comic book author. He played the alien Lenier in the well-known series Babylon 5, and still voices a multitude of cartoons today. As a musician, he's performed for many years in a musical comedy duo, and has recorded dozens of albums, and his songs have aired on popular radio shows. In the revived version of The Twilight Zone, he even played the adult version of his eerie character, whose daughter was played by his own daughter, Liliana, an actress as well. It's also striking that as a child, he got to work with nearly every star of the era, from Walt Disney to Lucille Ball. Little David appeared in just one episode of The Fugitive, but Bill Mumy became a true science fiction legend and a multifaceted artist, beloved by fans the world over. At number 12, we have Bruce Dern, one of the most astonishing examples of this show's hidden stars. He turned up on The Fugitive again and again, playing 5 different characters over 4 years. Bruce was about 27 when he first showed up in one of the episodes, as just one more of the strangers the fugitive doctor meets along the way. In 2026, Bruce turns 90 and is a living Hollywood legend who's still working actively. Few people knew that Bruce comes from an influential family. His grandfather was governor of Utah and U.S. Secretary of War, and a great uncle of his was a well-known poet. He got his start in the theater, where he was discovered by director Elia Kazan himself, who invited him to study at a prestigious acting school. In the 1960s, Bruce became famous for playing unhinged psychopathic villains, including in Alfred Hitchcock films like Marnie, and that typecasting dogged him for a long time. But then the new Hollywood era arrived and he flourished. He earned his first Oscar nomination for playing a Vietnam veteran in the drama Coming Home. Decades later, at 77, he hit his peak playing an aging father in the black-and-white drama Nebraska, for which he won Best Actor at the Cannes Film Festival and his second Oscar nomination. He also worked with Quentin Tarantino on The Hateful Eight and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Bruce is the father of the famous actress Laura Dern, and, just this May 2026, appeared to a standing ovation at the Cannes Film Festival for the premiere of a documentary about his own life. The anonymous passersby Bruce played long ago have been forgotten, but Bruce Dern proved that a character actor can become one of the most respected artists of his generation and keep working at 90. At number 13, we have Kurt Russell, who as a child played Philip Gerard Jr., the son of that pursuing lieutenant, in a second season episode titled Nemesis in 1964. Kurt was about 13 when his little character is accidentally kidnapped by none other than Richard Kimble, his father's sworn enemy. In 2026, Kurt turns 75 and is the only one in this story who went on to become a genuine, top-tier global superstar. Few people knew that Kurt got his start precisely as a child actor, and one of the most astonishing facts in his biography is that the dying Walt Disney in 1966 wrote the name Kurt Russell on a slip of paper as one of his final words. The studio had just signed a long-term contract with the young actor. Kurt became Disney's big star in the 1970s, and then transformed into an icon across every genre. He played the legendary Sheriff Wyatt Earp in the Western Tombstone, the anti-hero Snake Plissken in Escape from New York, a firefighter in Backdraft, a colonel in the science fiction film Stargate, and even voiced Elvis. It was on the set of a Disney musical that he met Goldie Hawn, with whom he's lived happily for more than 40 years without ever formally marrying. His son, Wyatt Russell, also became a well-known actor. In 2017, Kurt and Goldie each received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame together. Gerard's son barely appeared once on The Fugitive, but Kurt Russell proved that sometimes a tiny childhood role gives rise to one of the longest and most brilliant careers in Hollywood. And finally, Robert Keith as Dr. John Kimble, Richard's father, whom we saw in that same first season in 1964. Robert was about 66 when he played The Fugitive's aged, ailing father. It was precisely the news of his retirement that drove Kimble to take the risk and return to his hometown. Robert died in December 1966 in Los Angeles at 68. His real name was Roland Keith Ritchie, and he was a respected character actor who appeared in several dozen films, especially in the 1950s, and who also shone on the Broadway stage. There's a subtle irony in this cast. Robert was the father of actor Brian Keith, who played one of Kimble's antagonists in the very first episode of the series. So father and son each entered this story in turn. Few people knew that Robert's path in the movies began not as an actor, but as a playwright. Hollywood took notice of him precisely because of one of his plays. He performed in legendary Broadway productions, and his final on-screen work was the role of a wealthy patriarch in a famous episode of The Twilight Zone titled The Masks. But the saddest page of his biography has to do with one of his wives. In 1927, he married the young Broadway actress Peg Entwistle. They divorced a couple of years later, and in 1932, Peg's name was etched forever into Hollywood's darkest legend. She took her own life by jumping from the letter H of the famous Hollywoodland sign, becoming a tragic symbol of the city's broken dreams. Dr. John Kimble embodied the home and family Richard so desperately longed to return to, and Robert Keith left behind both a worthy filmography and an acting dynasty that carried on through his famous son. That's how different the fates turned out to be for the people who brought one of the best series in television history to life. Some left far too soon in their prime. Others built half-century careers. One went from a single-episode guest to a top-tier global superstar, and still others are filming to this day, in their 80s and 90s. The Fugitive ended with the highest-rated finale of its era, which the whole country watched, but the stories of its actors are still alive and still surprising us decades later. Dozens of future Hollywood legends passed behind the cameras of this show, and each of them carried away a little piece of that era. If you enjoyed this trip into the past and the present, don't forget to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which character from The Fugitive you remember best and which cult series you'd like to learn more about next time. See you next time.